China launched market-oriented reforms and opened up to the rest of the world in the late 1970s, laying the groundwork for extraordinary economic growth. Today, China reigns supreme, accounting for more than 18% of global GDP, a performance unrivaled by any other country. However, the CCP has been pulling the wool over our eyes the entire time. They've been cooking the books. And we're not talking about a little deception here. We're talking about a stunning 60% deceit. So, let us discuss China's GDP lies. Gross domestic product tells us how big and powerful a country's economy is. But hold on, China's GDP figures aren't exactly reliable. They tend to be distorted, so we can't fully trust them. And China's a real oddball when it comes to GDP. Their economy is huge, way bigger than those of other developing nations. They've been growing like crazy for years. But here's the twist. China's economy is quite different from the top-notch advanced economies out there. There's something unique about the way they do things. For one, unlike most leading nations with open societies, China's authoritarian regime limits personal freedoms. Just look at the numbers. China's freedom score in 2021 was a meager 9, one of the lowest globally. Meanwhile, the top economies like the US, Japan, Germany, and the UK scored well above 80, indicating freedom. The only other major economy with a comparable score to China is Saudi Arabia, but its GDP is just a fraction, only 5% of China's colossal economic size. And another thing that sets China apart is that it still labels itself a developing economy. But there's more to the story. Development within China is a patchwork with stark disparities between coastal and inland regions. Take Beijing, the wealthiest region, with a per capita GDP of $28,500, matching advanced economies. Meanwhile, in Gansu, China's poorest province, the per capita GDP is less than $6,400, on par with Libya. So while China waves the developing country flag, it's a tale of two Chinas, a thriving metropolis rubbing shoulders with struggling regions. China's GDP growth has been a showstopper, leaving the rest of the world in awe. Since 1990, they've been averaging over 9% growth per year, sometimes even hitting a staggering 14%. That's way speedier than the global average. These numbers are mind-blowing, especially when you consider China's massive population of over 1 billion. Sure, their GDP growth took a hit in 2020 due to that pesky pandemic, dropping to a lowly 2.2%, but it still outperformed most countries out there. The International Monetary Fund released their latest forecast in October 2022, projecting a 4.4% GDP growth for China in 2023. Meanwhile, a Reuters poll had experts predicting a modest 4% growth. The IMF wasn't so optimistic about China, though. They know that these forecasts can flip-flop. The head of the IMF hinted in early 2023 that skyrocketing COVID-19 cases in China could put a damper on the economy, leading to a potential slowdown and a revision of future growth forecasts. So, did it affect China like they thought it would? Turns out, the answer is no. China dropped the GDP bombshell in April. They unveiled their numbers and guess what? Their economy grew, a whopping 4.5% compared to last year. Looking further ahead, the IMF predicts China's nominal GDP will surpass $26 trillion by 2027, widening the gap between them and major economies like the European Union, Japan, and India, although they're still chasing the United States. So what's really going on behind those numbers? Is China as powerful as it seems, or is there more to the story? So here's a wild idea for measuring economic growth. Forget the government numbers and look at satellite images instead. Turns out those twinkling lights at night can tell us a lot about how well an economy is doing. Take the Korean Peninsula, for example. South Korea, all bright and democratic, shines like a disco party from space. Meanwhile, North Korea, under Kim Jong-un's rule, is as dark as a cave. You can practically see the economic gap just by comparing the light intensity. Economist Luis Martinez from the University of Chicago took the satellite imagery concept to a whole new level. He analyzed the brightness of lights at night and compared it to the reported GDP growth in different countries. And guess what? He found that China might have been fibbing their growth for the past 2 decades. Their economy could actually be around 1/3 smaller than they claim. Luis discovered that authoritarian regimes with their strong incentives to make themselves look good tend to inflate their GDP figures. The more power hungry they are, the bigger the exaggeration. He estimates that autocracies overstate their yearly GDP growth by a whopping 35%. That's some serious number manipulation. So those shimmering lights reveal a more nuanced truth about an autocracy's actual prosperity. Here's the deal. China's official GDP figures are about as trustworthy as a used car salesman's promises. Studies have revealed that Chinese officials have a knack for exaggerating their economic data, and they've got political motivations to back it up. Who doesn't want to brag about a booming economy, right? Now, in a democracy, you've got checks and balances to keep things in check. The media digs deep, the opposition asks tough questions, and there's even freedom of information requests. But in China, it's a different story. The government and the CCP are the ones calling the shots when it comes to calculating and publishing GDP numbers. There's no independent agency like the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the USA to keep them in line. And guess what? China has found a sneaky way to pump up their GDP. It's like an exploit in a video game. They just crank up government spending, even if it doesn't make a lick of sense. Need a new swimming pool in the parliament? Sure, why not? It's all about making the numbers look good, even if it means throwing money at questionable projects. Plus, their administration is sketchy. Local governments hold a lot of power, and they're not shy about bending the truth to make themselves look good. A study from 2019 spilled the beans, revealing that these local governments have been inflating GDP numbers for years. It's like they're blowing up a balloon of industrial output and investment figures, especially since the mid-2000s. But why the charade? Well, it all boils down to performance evaluations. The CCP's organization department came up with a brilliant idea in the late 1990s. Judge local officials based on economic development, fiscal growth, and living standards. Suddenly, it became a competition among local governments to outshine each other, like a race for the shiniest trophy. And guess what? Some of them turned to creative accounting to boost the numbers. It's no secret that local governments play fast and loose with GDP data. The National Bureau of Statistics tries to keep things in check by adjusting the reported numbers, but it's an uphill battle. The researchers discovered that after 2008, the exaggeration of local GDP went into overdrive, while the NBS struggled to keep up with the adjustments. And the result? The true GDP growth rate was likely overstated by almost 2 percentage points from 2010 to 2016. It's like a game of smoke and mirrors where local governments are pulling tricks to outdo each other. The truth behind China's GDP is a lot murkier than they'd like you to believe. China's GDP might be a whole lot smaller than they claim. Dr. Yuri Shashfort did some digging while using data from the satellite research and found that China's actual GDP is supposedly 60% smaller than what the CCP tells us. This revelation has serious implications, especially for their debt. If China's actual GDP is much smaller than claimed, their debt to GDP ratio shoots up. That's a red flag for investors and lenders who rely on these numbers to gauge China's economic health. A high debt to GDP ratio means China's debt burden gets even heavier. It could shake investor confidence, making it harder for China to get affordable financing in the future. Repaying debts could become a struggle if their economic growth isn't as strong as they say. It may even lead to credit rating downgrades, making borrowing money internationally more costly for China. But it's not just China that's affected. As one of the world's biggest economies, any major economic slowdown or debt crisis in China sends shockwaves globally. It could mess with international trade, financial markets, and even the stability of other economies. But what do you think this means for the country's debt and the global economy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to know more, don't miss the next video. We'll see you next time.